Hey guys, so I'm gonna try to do this video with Atlas. It's been having problems today, which is unfortunate because I really like using Atlas for doing things like this, videos like this. So I do want to say that before I start, my mouth is getting dry for some reason. So I do have a soda right here. So if you see me drinking it, it's because I'm talking a lot. Which usually doesn't happen when I do videos. Very rarely. But, let's see how this goes. So, there's been a few updates with Tyler Robinson. And I have notes here. I have Atlas right here. So I'll be reading my notes. They won't show up over here. I don't know, I might not even go through all the notes. I don't know yet. I don't want to go too deep into everything because I don't want to lose people. I mean, we can do this. We can spread this out. We ain't got to do a 1 hour video on this. So, me and ChatGPT already had this discussion, and I just want to bring this out. So, and I'll mention something else here when I read this. So, anyways, let's get started. So, before I said, do you see the problem with this? And it was saying something else unrelated. And I said, I mean between conservatives and the federal government. It says, yes, and now that you name the actors, the problem is even clearer. Between conservatives and the federal government, the problem is phase misalignment with shared power. They are not operating on different moral systems. They are operating on the same system at different phases of time and authority. Here's a clean breakdown. Now, when I read this, something else came to mind. It's kind of related, it's kind of not, but there's a lot of law enforcement out there, pro-law enforcement, who also support ICE, which is the federal government. But here's the problem. Operationally, if you're in law enforcement and you support ICE, everything they do, that's not a good thing because you're actually getting monitored by the DOJ. Because you might think that you're on the same side, but you're not. The problem lies in that ICE operates in the civil cases and criminal cases. And if you're working in a police department and you're seeing it as all criminal, well, that's and I 100% agree that the DOJ should get involved in police departments that blur those lines. And I saw that language used in here, and it made me think about that. So it's a misalignment of their shared power, and they're the same system at different phases of time and authority. So, yeah. And the DOJ, a significant portion of grants money that goes to police departments throughout the United States is by the DOJ. Some cities, not so much, like Houston, maybe Dallas, but they can make their own money. They have the ability to avoid the influence of the DOJ. But anyways, that's what that reminded me of. It's kind of related, kind of not. So, here's the thing. Let's see. The core problem. Conservatives are operating as if they are already the state. The federal government is operating as if it still must manage the state. So, conservatives have this thing about the deep states and all these other things. The truth be told, that if they actually knew the Constitution, the word state is not defined. It doesn't define what it is in a U.S. territory. It doesn't define what all it does. All it is basically is recognizing an official authority that can act as a government of power. Now, ideologies don't fit that. They can, socially they can, but constitutionally they can't. And that's what this misalignment it's talking about right here. So, conservatives are, even if they don't say that, or even if they don't express it like that, their actions convey that. And it doesn't even have to be all of them. It can be a small group of them, where they want to take control, and there are some hardcore conservatives. Some really hardcore ones. And people underneath them would blame the liberals for doing it. So they're kind of like working for the big, the conservatives at the top. It's the hardcore ones. And the federal government's job is to operate as if it must manage the state. So the federal government constitutionally can't do anything, although, and we're going to see this with Tyler Robinson. This has everything to do with Tyler Robinson. So both are coupled, both move together, but one is acting from the future of control, conservatives, and the other is receding from the present of legitimacy. Now, another thing here, and I remember talking about this a few years ago, and I remember that right before I did this video, vaguely I remember talking to somebody about how the Constitution wasn't written for the people back then, but it's written for a future that's coming. And today that makes a lot more sense, because we didn't have a powerful federal government back then. But the United States 2.0, under a more solidified understanding of the Constitution, as me and you are talking here, it's not up for interpretation. It's where the federal government delegates its power through the U.S. Constitution. So the Supreme Court, Congress, and all them, that comes from federal government allowing it in the future and not the past. So it was building up to that. And I think that's very interesting about the U.S. Constitution. So conservatives, they may understand the Constitution, but they don't understand, and they may manipulate it, but they still don't own the power. They don't own the buildings. They don't own... They can say, well, we're taxpayers. That ain't going to cut it, because taxes... Congress, we already talked about all this. Congress retroceded, gave back the land from D.C. to the... And it brought questioning to the validity of the Constitution. And the entire court system in the United States in general. But that's a topic for another time. But yeah, under future understanding is that it's not the conservatives that are going to be able to control power and be able to kill anyone they don't agree with, even though it is, we're going to the outcome. But that would be bad for anybody. That would be bad for liberals. That would be bad for conservatives. That would be bad for any ideology to have that, to act as the state, to have that power. So the federal government, if they get involved, well, they're manipulated to get involved because they got to be influenced by what conservatives are doing. And if they don't get involved, then they're lagging behind, and the conservatives gain all that power, and there's going to be a huge fallout anyway. Which one do you want to control? Do you want to manage it, or do you... I mean, I will say this, and it's in my notes. I meant to say this at the beginning of this video. There are people who watch this video and think, well, if Charlie Kirk was doing all this stuff, why didn't the federal government intervene? Why did they tell him to stop? Why did they let him continue? I agree. They should, 100% agree. They should have intervened. They should have told Charlie, you're really pushing limits here. Now, would he listen? Would he say it's considered deep state is trying to take him down? Whatever. Probably, but we'll know the truth if they did that or not in the future. And I would say that they probably tried, but it is what it is. This creates a structural deadlock. How the phase shows up. Conservatives, the leading phase. Act as if legitimacy is already settled because of the President Trump and what he's doing. Treat ideology as sovereign. That would put the conservatives in that would make the majority sovereign. Well, that's implying that the conservatives are the majority. There's conservatives in everybody in the United States. Even in liberals. Because that's what keeps the state stable. It creates a society. It creates a foundation for society. So, but if you have conservatives pull themselves out of that, you can get really serious problems with that. View institutions as tools, not constraints. And that's the thing too. They could use the federal government as their tools. And that's if I was to talk to someone, I know some conservatives I could talk to, and they would definitely say, well, we want to control the deep state. Well, how do you know the deep state isn't controlling you? And how do you know that they're not just aligning to what you're saying and just agreeing with you because, you're a threat, Believe outcomes justify authority. That's the court case of Tyler Robinson. We're going to get into that. Assume enforcement is inevitable. From their perspective, we are the system now. Stop pretending otherwise. Federal government, lagging phase. Still bound to procedural optics, due process. Still tied to the Constitution. But they can move socially as well. You just have to make it aligned to the... You just gotta make it look constitutional. You gotta set it up. It's a chess game. The federal government, the Constitution isn't designed to have chess games for the federal government. But also, this was before, when the Constitution was written, that was before we had, when we came out of Civil War, we started gaining, we had the Pinkertons. We didn't have the FBI. We had precursors to the FBI, but we didn't have the CIA. We didn't have the DOD. We didn't have the Pentagon. We didn't have that stuff. We had very little managed organizations where today the conservatives are those organizations, but the federal government is a really, really big institution. It can make you believe whatever it wants you to believe. Whether you believe it's a constitution or not, they can make you believe it. Must preserve legitimacy across factions. So they have to look legitimate for liberals, conservatives, the U.S. government, the rhinos, for democracy, right? They gotta look the same across the board. They gotta look like everyone's in line. They gotta make you believe that they are siding with the conservatives if you have a Republican president. And they can't look like liberals. You gotta play with them. Don't look like you're off step. Cannot openly acknowledge loss of narrative control. Uses delay, ambiguity, and neutrality as tools. Avoids decisive moves that would reveal overall power. Unless they are forced to. But with everything else coming down, and I've noticed, and it wasn't something I just noticed, judges have said this as well, all across the United States, that now cases for like minor offenses like trafficking, not not tra- I'm gonna say traffic violations. For example, they would go into court a year, 2 years, even 5 years later, and don't have it resolved. Um, in some cases, it could take, like, you could have a court case, and the probable cause comes, and there's no probable cause yet. And and people are bringing their kids to court. And everyone's having an excuse for not being coming to court. It's a fall of the collapse of the court system. From his perspective, if we acknowledge that shift openly, we accelerate collapse. And the collapse that the federal government would have is the collapse of federalism. And the collapse of federalism would be suicide to them. But they would actually gain all that power back and steal it from the conservatives. Like just sweep it under their feet. It says why this is dangerous. Because both sides are partially correct. But each is blind to the cost of their timing. That's why we have a National Security Council. That's why we have people you can't vote for. That is why I think that was more true in the 19th century. Not the 20th century. The 20th century, you had the NSC and the security councils and all that, and they're appointed in Congress, and you can't vote for them. The people in NSC are people who served in the military. They're ex-presidents. They're CIA agents. They're FBI. They worked in the federal government, and you do not. They're hard to vote out of power, and you don't vote for them either. They just come with experience in staffing and all that, and they do make policy decisions for Congress. Conservatives' blind spot. They confuse momentary dominance with durable sovereignty. So the system is already created in such a way that goes against conservatives. That's good news, but what does that look like in action? I'm not, almost 20 minutes and we haven't even got to the title yet. So I do that right after I read all this. That leads to overreach, ideological absolutism, treating dissent as illegitimate, and attempting to force reality to align now. Federal government's blind spot. It confuses procedural restraint with continued control. That depends on what you define as the federal government. I'm talking about the big boys. I'm talking about the FBI. I'm talking about the CIA. I'm talking about the DOD. I'm talking about all of them working in unison. Not Congress. I'm not talking about Congress. I'm not talking about the White House. I'm not talking about the Supreme Court. I'm talking about the big boys that could run this country without them. And they will know all this stuff already. That leads to underreaction, loss of deterrence, erosion of trust, and appearing complicit or weak. The real failure mode, when ideology begins acting as if it already owns the state, and the state refuses to admit and must reassert authority. Power moves faster than legitimacy, and legitimacy dissolves faster than power can stabilize. That's when courts become battlegrounds. Law becomes symbolic. Enforcement looks selective, and everyone starts acting independently while still blaming institutions. Well, this feels like no one is wrong, but everything is breaking, because this isn't moral conflict. It's timing conflict over who gets to speak for reality. The conservatives are saying the future has already arrived. They're going to say that when this case, we know that's going to go to death penalty. The federal government is saying if we admit that, we lose the present. And both statements can be true at the same time. The unsaid truth, if the federal government does nothing, conservatives consolidate de facto sovereignty. That's ideology takes over sovereignty, the majority rule. And that's representing the president as a republic. If the federal government acts openly, it reveals how much coercive power it still holds and fractures legitimacy. The legitimacy of open interpretation that the United States Constitution has. It would destroy the United States government as we know it. It takes on Congress, Treasury Department, all of that. So it delays, and conservatives interpret delay as victory. The feedback loop is a problem. The crisis isn't left versus right. It's ideology outrunning institution while institution team. Now, people would argue that, well, if you collapse ideology, then wouldn't people still have ideologies for themselves and create factions and groups and all this? You have to create such of a system where they don't do that. Where you have to get them out of that mentality. And sure, yeah, America is going to get the huge brunt force of that because that's how they grew up thinking. So let's look at this Tyler thing. Let's look at. Hopefully it doesn't lag. But if I do, I better go to Google because I know that if I do that, it's going to start a new chat session. So I'm going to do Tyler Robinson. I'm just going to Google it. And there were some updates from the last day or so. So he's back in court. This is a high-profile case. What makes us different from other high-profile cases, that's O.J. Simpson, that's Jodi Arias. If you remember her, she's from her verdict came in 2013. Yeah, it was 2013, I believe. There was Casey Anthony. There was Scott. Who was it? I think it was Scott Peterson. I think it's Patterson. But yeah, those are high-profile cases. The difference between this and all those other ones is that this is ideology. Ideology is moving this. They're controlling the verdicts. And I can tell that based on what I can make the shape of this is that there is a jury in this. And I've already said that I was really impressed with the judge refusing to release certain information for the media. Because the media keeps requesting more information. Like Fox News and Erica Kirk, they're requesting information to come out. And the judge is like, we don't want to... He's pulling himself back. Because he wants to focus on the bare metal. He doesn't want the ideologies to control the courts. They're going to control the courts anyways. So what that would do, what that would look like in practice is the prosecution would go heavy and use the outside to push the prosecution. And the defense would be, they would be pulling back, doing the bare minimum of a defense. Because, well, there'll be different reasons for that. One could be, well, you know your guy is guilty, but the prosecution is going to push a death penalty. And then what's going to happen for the jury is they're going to be the prosecution is going to get into their mind and push a death penalty verdict based on the outside of the courtroom. There's nothing unconstitutional about that, and that is due process. But the problem is ideology is controlling the verdict, which does violate due process. And it doesn't at the same time. We need... Let's see if this works. Or is it going to lag? So while that loads it, figure out what due process is. So, Utah prosecutor denies conflict of interest. I think that it was something like their 18-year-old... They had an 18-year-old who I think was at the scene at the time this happened. So it created a conflict with the prosecutor. But outside of that, lawyers of Charlie Kirk's alleged killer, that's the defense. That's to have prosecutors thrown off case. That is possible. They wouldn't even do that to a jury. So yeah, I don't know if they will or not. So yeah, that's all the information I have. I'm not gonna click these links. If you do, you can. Um. So, like I was saying before, the judge's actions suggest he doesn't want anything to do with his verdict, and it implies that conservatives are going to run this case. Smart judge. Judges do that even outside of ideology, but they do it to protect certain information, sensitive information. But in this particular case, you can tell that you need to focus on the evidence and not on the outside. Because if you brought in more information and it goes outside, you will create an avalanche of the verdict, and the defense will be completely. So he's giving him the defense at least some opportunity. It's not going to do anything, but the opportunity is there. I've never seen anything like this where it's so clear cut and everyone has a role to play. You know how the prosecution is going to do it. You know how the defense is doing it. You know how the judge is doing it. And you know how they all operate together and how it influences the decision of the jury. I can already tell. I don't even have to read this to know that there's a jury involved, just because of how the setup is. So conservative, and I have this in my notes. Conservatives will protest and get upset if there's no death penalty. Charlie Kirk was a proponent of eye for an eye, and he believed in the death penalty. So his supporters are going to say death penalty, right? And the word around the street is that conservatives, I'm not going to say any names of how I know this, but I will say that it's from someone who has deep connections to conservatives. It is a real known figure. According to him, Tyler Robinson should be declared or seen as a domestic terrorist. Now, here's the thing about that. Is there evidence that supports that? Now, I don't know. I don't know the criteria for a death penalty. I don't even know what that is defined by as the federal government to do a domestic terrorist, because that wouldn't be a state thing. That would be a federal thing. Now, the feds could use that as target, but do they have any evidence to do that for jurisdiction? I don't know if that carries a death penalty. But if it was to go, the only way that I could think of that working would be if you somehow tied it to treason. You would have to have it against the United States government itself. I don't know if you could push it that hard. That's, like I said, I don't know. Because that's a very high standard. You have to go through committees and all that. I mean, you gotta have the right setup for that on the federal level. I don't know if they got that. But if you're pushing for it, I mean, they could, the federal government don't have to go for domestic terrorism. Because, if they don't go for domestic terrorism, then that means that's a signal that the federal government are not being moved by the conservatives. That's a good sign. That's a very good thing. Now they could go for another statute that was violated. I mean, I don't know what that would be. But if you can use that, but it has to be something that carries the death penalty. It has to carry the death penalty. Now, there's a catch-22 with that, because if the federal government carries the death penalty for someone who's against conservatives, they would say, well, this will get back at the liberals, and we'll make sure that no Democrat gets back in power. We'll make sure that Republicans will get back in power. So with that mentality, of course, I know that there will not be no more Democrats in power. I know that it's going to be all Republicans. with the exception of AOC. We talked about that. AOC will be vice president with a Republican as a, and that hasn't happened. I think the last time that has happened is with, was it Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Jackson? I believe they were different parties, and one was Andrew Jackson was his vice president and eventually became his president. But yeah, but they would get president of a conservatives are think that a president under federal government is granting him that power. But no, it's not the president getting us that power. It's the federal government that grants power that there is a president to begin with. Remember what I said, it's flipped because the Constitution was built for a country that hadn't existed yet. It would be an ideological crime. You don't want to cross that line. But in this particular case, you do, because you would actually override the state, where in this case you could use that power to save a life rather than destroy it. Actually, his life would still be destroyed because he'd have to be moved somewhere else to another country where they don't know his name and they don't really know who Charlie Kirk is, if they even care about Charlie Kirk. Probably Eastern Europe, but that would probably be the best place. Let's see what else. And of course, the federal government will say that he just died in prison, and the conservatives are going to hold this celebration, have a symbolic day where he's dead, and they would have no idea that he's actually still alive on the other side. That's leverage that the federal government can use to retain power. So you can't beat the federal government at all. Even though you might know the Constitution, you might say, well, they're following the Constitution, but their power is delegated. Your understanding of it is a delegation, borrowed power from the federal government, which exists now, but didn't exist in 1776. Well, kind of before that, I don't know the exact year because it wasn't ratified until 1776. And that was the whole thing between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and why we have the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. The next ones after that, they're written in ambiguity of the Constitution, and that's where you get things like sovereign citizens and all that out of. It's a bunch of nonsense, really. The U.S. Constitution, honestly, to be honest with you, it's crap. It's crap paper. It's not worth anything, really. I mean, 10 years from now, we're going to think, why are we using the Constitution? Why did we follow the Constitution and not question this? That's what it's going to look like in 10 years. And the way that I see it, the analogy would be that the Constitution was just passed around a table with the drunken guys we call the Founding Fathers. That's all it means to me. The ambiguity, it looks cute and cool and all that, you could reinterpret all that. But what does that mean in the real world? It means nothing. It's crap. Plain and simple. It only works for people who know how to use it in power. That's not me and you. That's not the conservatives. That's not the liberals. That's not anyone voting for anything. Those are the Constitution is for people who are in power already. That's who it serves. Let's see. So, the liberals would protest this and be against the federal government doing all that against a person because they know what it means. But they can't do anything about it. You can't protest. Protesting would be stupid. But if you were going to play chess against conservatives, that's what you would do. And there might be some conservatives that are watching my videos and think, oh, well, we can do that. But you also got to remember, too, that there could be federal agents who watch my videos too, and they're like, we know how to get around things. Conservatives, they can try, but they don't know as much, and they don't have as much power. It's not about money. It ain't about money. Conservatives would think, well, it's all about money. It's all about no. It's about economics and understanding the economics of politics. The movement of different countries. You don't have that power. Conservatives under Trump have been reducing their power from foreign countries, not gaining more. So, yeah, it's bringing it to the from the from the nation of from America that the United States resides in. So let's go to what it says about due process. What is due process? Due process is the principle that the government must follow fair, established procedures before it can take away a person's life, liberty, and property. That's what's happening now. Death penalty takes away someone's life. So we're going to go through here, and I'm going to tell you the problems with due process. All right, so it says procedural due process. The how. The government must use fair procedures. The court system, or mainly the court system. The government must use fair procedures. Notice of what you're accused of. A neutral decision maker. A chance to be heard and defend yourself. Rules applied consistently. Decisions based on evidence, not pressure or ideology. This is about process, not outcome. Substantive due process, the what. Even if procedures are followed, the government cannot do certain things at all. It can't punish arbitrarily. It can't impose outcomes that violate fundamental rights. It can't use power in ways that are fundamentally unfair or abusive. This is about limits on power, not paperwork. The short version. Due process means the state can't just decide an act. It must justify, constrain, and prove its actions within recognized rules of fairness. Why it matters in the conflict you're pointing at. Due process exists specifically to slow power when ideology outruns institutions, outcomes are obvious to one faction, or authority wants to skip steps because it thinks the future is settled. It's a break, nowhere, not a moral judgment. Due process is the rule that power must explain itself before it acts, and accept limits even when it thinks it's right. I said, what is a paragraph that's Bill of Rights? It is. What is it? I forget which one. See, now it's lagging again. I could have just used Google and it would have told me. But I wanted to know. I'm going to show you the problem with due process. Yeah, it's having problems. Yeah, it's lagging. Alright, here it is. The exact language of Bill of Rights, the Fifth Amendment, that establishes due process is as follows. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Here's the full Fifth Amendment so you can see it in context. Here's the thing. So we're going to see. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. He has to have a jury. Grand jury. Except in cases right in the flank of naval forces or in the militia. When in actual service, the time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject to the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy. That's called double jeopardy. For those who didn't know. Of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall be private for public use without just compensation. So it doesn't use the keywords that I'm using, but it is bringing it up. I know that in some instances it does. Why this matters for what you're pointing out. Notice that it doesn't define. It doesn't define what the government is. It doesn't define what law is. It doesn't define what due is. It doesn't define what process is. These are interpretations set by not the Constitution, but the Supreme Court. But they haven't really defined what that means. Not the government is a majority. Under a democracy, it would be the majority. So you could say that the ideology would be the majority under the president, because that would be representation of a majority of voters, right? So I wish it used the word government. It doesn't say government. It might be the 14th Amendment that would say that. We're going to check. I'm going to try that. The vagueness is intentional. It's why due process becomes a battleground when ideology pressures outcomes. Institutions like reality or factions act as if they already are the state. Yeah, the next logical step is to look at the 14th Amendment. I just said that, which applies due process to the states, and that's where your conservative versus federal government problem really explodes. What does the 14th say? It's probably going to reload again. It's lagging again. Oh, wait, no, it's working. Key language of the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. That matters here. This sentence is from section 1. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. It doesn't define what the Constitution doesn't define what a state is. It doesn't tell you, is it a territory? Is it like, what is it? Is it a government? Is it institutions? It isn't defined. It's not defined. Nor shall any state deprive any person I'm gonna refresh. Usually when I refresh this, it shows it up. So I do last time. I mean, on the app, it already shows it on here. I don't know what's wrong with. I don't need Safari anymore, so I'll just go ahead. Well, I don't need Atlas anymore for web browsing, so I'll just switch to the app. Alright, so let's read this. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So what is the jurisdiction of a state? Well, it doesn't define what a state is. A state can't operate. You could make the argument that an ideology is that conservatives are a state because it's a bit of a stretch, but you could say that conservatives are a state because it is recognized as a party. Well, actually, it would be the Republican Party, not the conservatives, but they use the Republican Party. So you could say, well, the Republican Party is the state, which would be the president, right? So it says, in that context, you say the president shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge no president shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privilege or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any president deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which means going through the court systems and all that. But you can create a court system first, and then you could carry it out. That's procedurally accurate. That's procedure. There's nothing unconstitutional about that. as long as they go through the process and have representation, the lawyers, the prosecutors, the judges, and even the jury, even if you can manipulate the jury to go on prosecutor's side, and there's nothing you can do about that, there's nothing unconstitutional about that. Is it moral? No. Is it ethical? No. But it is. That's the Constitution for you. Nor deny, and the president cannot deny to any person within his jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's the operative text, right? So you could replace state with pretty much it. You could say, no federal institution shall make or enforcing the laws. No territory of the United States shall make. You see what I'm saying there? It's ambiguous. It doesn't define what a state is. What changed compared to the Fifth Amendment? Fifth Amendment restrains the federal government. 14th Amendment restrains the states. Now you could say, well, if it restrained, could you flip those and say, well, we get power because, well, it definitely changes things. It does change how the death penalty comes together, and it is it's a more understanding, more, what am I trying to say here? It's a more graspable understanding of the death penalty where it's understood by everybody, and it's not just some arbitrary thing where that person committed a crime and they get the death penalty or they get that many years in prison. It's the death penalty is kind of is acting like a baseline for ideology. And when you do that, and people are afraid of that because in other countries, when they have that, of course, you get people who are killed in the streets and all, but that's not due process. You don't have the court system. So it is different. This is the move that federalizes due process, allows the federal government and federal courts to intervene in state action, and turns due process into a national standard, not just a local one. So if any state did this, and they saw that if conservatives or Republicans are violating this, where it can carry over to the president, the federal government will intervene. And of course, the federal government would be seen as the side of the president. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't. But, it's a big problem. It is a conflict. Why this is the fault line you're in circular. The 14th Amendment is where states claim procedural correctness, factions claim legitimacy. Factions, those factions would be any, define faction. That's even a ambiguous term because a state can be a faction. Ideologies can be factions. Parties can be factions. Anything can be a faction if there's a group of people. You just have two people and you can have a faction. Sometimes even one person, because if one person has an idea, that's a faction that they believe. So, yeah. And the federal government decides whether a state process is actually lawful or merely ideological, and which one is getting in the way. And the federal government cannot operate in such a way that goes against due process, and it can't do anything that goes against what the Constitution says. They can't. Not only I say can't. Socially they can. Constitutionally they can't. But they gotta have it look legitimate to at least the conservatives. That's why conflicts between conservatives operating through state systems and federal authority keep landing here. Based on what this says, in my understanding, conservatives, I would say I would say that the conservatives, even even if they don't make notes and don't have intention, or even if they don't have any knowledge, they can be in a situation where they do they can commit political violence in a way that they don't know is classified as political violence. Um, and it is bad, but what I would call, this is not a term used in the U.S. Constitution, but what I would say for Tyler is he needs what I would call federal counsel. He needs the big guys on this, the big guys, to protect other people and know the dangers of what is going on. And you might be thinking, why do I want to save someone's life? Why would I want to save someone's life from this? Part of it is just to see if I could be honest with you. And I'm sure that there are many people who would think the same way. Like, what could we do to save someone's life if we were using the thing that would take away someone's life? It's risky, but it would definitely wake people up to the realities of what goes on in reality and in practice. Not in theory or political theory, but what... Because it's a matter of mob rule. Mob rule is controlling whether people live or die based on majority. And that's not right. That would be wrong to a lot of people. But based on what's going on, you're setting a example where if the federal government doesn't get involved, where the states can now issue death penalties against liberals. Or do you want the federal government to have that power where it's tied to the president? Now, the president would obviously choose when to use it or when not to use it. And they can definitely say no to conservatives, which is a signal that they don't listen to conservatives. Another great thing. People see the federal government as evil and bad and all this. No, the Constitution made you believe that. It was designed where people couldn't be... It had its heart in the right place. The Constitution does. But in the modern world, not really. It has created a situation where we have become so big as a society. Information passes so fast that everyone can be against each other and no one knows what's going on. And you lose the generation. You lose a generation because a generation believes that they don't know what's going on. And it weaponizes those people against other people using the government. And that's... And you would say, well, slavery did that, but this is different because you're actually putting people's lives... People can just die because of their beliefs and what domestic terrorism and all this, and we want to use these terms like Charlie Kirk was some sort of, I don't know, de facto president of some kind of the United States that people should listen to. You know, it's a bad situation all around, and I do agree that the federal government is not your friend. In the notes that I gave, the federal government is not your friend in any of this. But the alternative is, if it's not the federal government, it's an ideology. Which one's worse? Federal government is very powerful. Conservatives are just an ideology with no real institutional backing, but it's all about perception, and it's bad. But yeah, like I said, the FBI, CIA, who else would be involved? ATF, there'll be another one. Though conservatives don't really like ATF, but well, they don't like the federal government at all. But if they align to those principles, then they would go along with it, and then they wouldn't even bother with the states anymore. They would say, well, we have power of federal authority and federal government, even when they don't. So, how due process can be technically followed but substantively violated, or how ideology tries to occupy the role of the state under the 14th. So, yeah, everything under the 10th Amendment, 14th Amendment, as you see here, the language is not defined. In fact, there was even one, I don't even remember what it was. It was talking about the government. Like, who's the government? Who's the state? Like, you know, the government. So, yeah, it's a bunch of ambiguity, and so, yeah. So, it's been less than an hour, but I've talked about pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. If there's another update, I'll talk about it. But I thought about talking about Tyler Robinson for a while. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So guys, I'll see you guys in the next video. And so I got the hiccups right now. I see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.